They say every generation rebels in its own way, that youth is loud, defiant, certain. But some generations do not rebel. They adapt. Born between 1970 and 1990, you were not raised by the internet, yet you were expected to master it. You learned to write letters before you learned to send emails. You memorized phone numbers before algorithms began remembering you. What happens to a mind that grows up in stillness and matures in acceleration? What happens when patience becomes outdated? When privacy becomes performance? When independence becomes survival? This is not just about nostalgia. It is about identity formed during transition. It is about being the emotional bridge between eras. There is a silent pressure in standing between worlds, a quiet exhaustion in constantly adjusting, and perhaps no one ever named it. There is a particular kind of identity that does not announce itself. It does not march, it does not protest, it adapts. If you were born between 1970 and 1990, your childhood existed in a world that no longer exists. A world without constant connectivity, without permanent digital footprints, without algorithms shaping attention before you even understood what attention was. You grew up knocking on doors instead of sending messages. You waited for film to develop. You learned patience not as a virtue, but as reality. And then something shifted. Not gradually, not gently. The world accelerated. Technology did not slowly integrate into life. It reshaped it. Careers moved online. Relationships went public. Attention became currency. Privacy became optional. And you were asked to transition without pause. What does that do to a forming identity? Developmental psychology tells us that adolescence and early adulthood are the seasons when the self stabilizes, when beliefs harden into values, when patterns become personality. But for you, those seasons happened during upheaval. You were forming who you were, while the world was transforming what being even meant. There is a subtle psychological tension in that. You understand analog depth, the intimacy of physical presence, the slowness of handwritten words. But you also understand digital speed, the necessity of visibility, the efficiency of instant connection. You belong to both. And yet sometimes it feels like you fully belong to neither. Too young to be fully rooted in pre-digital permanence. Too old to feel native in hyper-digital fluidity. So you became fluent in both languages. You learned to code switch across eras, to remember what life felt like before constant noise, while surviving within it. Research on transitional generations suggests that adaptability increases during rapid cultural shifts. But so does cognitive load, the brain that constantly switches contexts from slow to fast, private to public, effortful to automated, expends more energy. Energy that is rarely acknowledged. You may not call it exhaustion, you may call it just life. But somewhere beneath the surface there is a quiet hum of adjustment. Always adjusting, always recalibrating, always staying relevant. Bridges do not complain about the weight they carry, they simply hold. But even bridges weather erosion, and when your identity has been shaped by transition, it is easy to forget what stillness feels like. Before the acceleration, there was stillness. Not perfect stillness, but spaciousness. Childhood moved differently then. Time did not fragment into notifications. Attention was not constantly pulled apart by invisible hands. If you wanted to know something, you searched for it deliberately. If you wanted to speak to someone, you waited. Waiting was not frustration, it was structure. You learned that effort preceded reward, that boredom was not danger, that silence was not emptiness. Psychologists now understand something important about those early rhythms. When a nervous system grows up in environments with delayed gratification, it develops tolerance. It builds patience like sediment layering slowly at the bottom of a river. It learns to sit with anticipation without collapsing into urgency. Your mind was shaped in that sediment, like long stretches of unstructured afternoons. Phone calls that required presence. Mistakes that disappeared with time instead of living online forever. Privacy was not curated, it was assumed. And then adulthood arrived in a different climate. The world did not simply speed up, it redefined speed as competence. Instant replies became professionalism. Constant availability became reliability. Visibility became validation. And something subtle began to shift inside you. A nervous system wired for depth found itself swimming in immediacy. Research on attention fragmentation shows that rapid digital stimulation keeps the brain in a low-grade stress state. Not enough to trigger alarm, just enough to sustain vigilance. The body remains slightly alert, slightly braced. Over time, this quiet activation feels normal. You may not call it stress. You may call it productivity. But sometimes when the day ends and silence finally returns, there is a strange restlessness, as if stillness is no longer entirely comfortable, as if the mind has been trained to expect interruption. That is the paradox. You were raised in slowness, but conditioned into speed, and part of you still remembers what depth feels like. It remembers reading without checking a screen. It remembers conversations that were not paused for updates. It remembers being unreachable, and safe in that unreachability. Perhaps this is why nostalgia carries warmth. Not because the past was flawless, but because the nervous system felt less divided. You were not performing yourself then. You were simply living. And when life becomes faster than integration, something within begins to lag behind. Not in ability, in rhythm. And change is often romanticized. They say progress is growth. That evolution is exciting. That speed is advancement. But acceleration has a psychological cost. When the world began to digitize at full force, it did not pause to ask whether your identity had stabilized. It did not wait for emotional integration. It did not slow down for reflection. It surged forward. Careers that once promised linear progression dissolved into uncertainty. Industries shifted overnight. Skills expired faster than experience could mature. The rules of success rewrote themselves in real time. And you were expected to keep up. Not gradually, instantly. Cognitive science refers to something called context switching, the mental process of shifting attention between tasks or environments. Each switch consumes energy. Each transition requires recalibration. When done occasionally, it strengthens flexibility. When done constantly, it fragments focus. Your generation did not just switch tasks. You switched eras, from paper to pixels, from permanence to updates, from local identity to global exposure. The brain does not adapt without effort. Neuroplasticity is powerful, but it is not effortless. Each new platform, each economic downturn, each cultural shift required recalibration. And recalibration is tiring, not dramatic exhaustion, not collapse, just a persistent hum beneath the surface. The hum of staying relevant, the hum of not falling behind, the hum of watching younger generations enter a world that already feels native to them. There can be a subtle disorientation in that. You remember when technology felt optional. Now it feels existential. You remember when privacy was default, and now it feels rare. You remember when identity was slower to form. Now it is curated in seconds. Psychologists studying rapid societal change have observed increased baseline anxiety during technological revolutions. Not always visible anxiety. Sometimes it manifests as hypercompetence, as constant self-improvement, as quiet vigilance. You adapt quickly, but adaptation is not neutrality, it is effort. Sometimes you may feel a low-grade pressure, not because you are incapable, but because the pace of change rarely slows long enough for integration. Identity becomes something you must continuously update, like software. And beneath the updates, there is a question that rarely gets asked. When does the system rest? When does the bridge stop reinforcing itself? You learn to thrive in acceleration, but thriving is not the same as ease. And the shock of acceleration did not make you weak. It made you adaptive. But adaptation, when constant, can feel like erosion. There is a certain admiration reserved for the independent one, the capable one, the adaptable one, the one who figures it out. If you grew up between shifting economies and accelerating systems, self-reliance was not a personality trait. It was a necessity. Promises felt conditional. Stability felt fragile. Career paths that once appeared solid dissolved like sand under rising water. Institutions changed, expectations shifted, the rules were rewritten mid-game. So you learn to rely on yourself, to troubleshoot, to self-teach, to pivot without waiting for permission. Psychology describes something called defensive independence, when autonomy forms not just from confidence, but from unpredictability. Now, when the environment feels unstable, the mind compensates by tightening control internally. Control becomes safety. You become the one who does not ask for help easily, the one who researches before reaching out, the one who absorbs pressure quietly. It looks like strength, and in many ways it is. But strength can become armor. Armor protects, but it also isolates. When you become known as the competent one, people assume you are fine. When you solve problems quickly, others forget that solving requires energy. When you rarely falter publicly, your fatigue remains invisible. There is a loneliness in always being capable. Attachment theory reminds us that emotional regulation is relational. Humans are wired for co-regulation, like for shared burdens, shared processing, shared rest. But if your identity fuses with self-sufficiency, like leaning feels foreign, asking feels unnecessary, vulnerability feels inefficient, and yet beneath the armor there is often quiet exhaustion, not resentment, not collapse, just the weight of carrying yourself through constant transition. You adapted to digital shifts without mentors. You navigated economic turbulence without guarantees. You recalibrated your identity repeatedly without ceremony. And you did it well. But sometimes, the one who adapts most smoothly is the one who receives the least support. Because competence hides strain. The myth says independence equals maturity. But psychological maturity is not isolation, it is integration. It is knowing when to hold yourself and when to be held. If you have spent years being your own safety net, it can feel unnatural to step back, to soften, to admit that even bridges need maintenance. Self-reliance protected you, but protection over time can become a quiet cage. And perhaps the armor you wear was never meant to be permanent. There is a reason certain songs feel like oxygen, a reason an old ringtone can stir something unexpectedly tender. A reason childhood bedrooms, even in memory, feel warmer than present-day apartments filled with modern convenience. It is easy to dismiss nostalgia as escapism, as resistance, as longing for a past that was imperfect. But psychologically, nostalgia is not regression. It is restoration. Memory acts like sediment at the bottom of a river. When the current becomes too strong, the mind reaches for something stable. Something anchored, something untouched by acceleration. For those born between 1970 and 1990, the past carries a particular texture. Before constant visibility, before identity was curated, before every mistake could be archived. Childhood unfolded mostly in private. Embarrassment faded, arguments dissolved, growth happened without permanent documentation. Now, nothing disappears easily, digital memory is relentless. And so the psyche searches for softer archives. Research shows that nostalgia increases feelings of meaning and belonging. It stabilizes mood. It reconnects you with earlier versions of yourself. Versions that existed before performance became constant. When you feel pulled toward 90s music, early internet simplicity, handwritten notes, or long afternoons without structure, you are not rejecting progress. You are seeking coherence. You are reconnecting with a rhythm that felt human. And nostalgia becomes a quiet sanctuary. Not because the past was flawless, but because it was slower. And slowness allowed integration. In slowness, emotions had space to settle. Identity had space to form. Relationships had space to deepen without metrics. Today, the present can feel like a river after heavy rain. Fast, loud, constantly shifting. And sometimes the mind returns to the calmer water upstream. There is no shame in that. Longing for simplicity does not mean you are incapable of complexity. It means your nervous system remembers a different cadence. But here lies the tension. If refugee is always behind you, the present can feel ungrounded. The goal is not to live in memory, it is to understand what memory represents. Not outdated technology, but psychological spaciousness. Not obsolete culture, but uncurated identity. And perhaps nostalgia is not a step backward. It is the psyche's way of reminding you what depth feels like. For a long time, being in between may have felt like imbalance, too analog for some spaces, too digital for others, too reflective for urgency, too aware of urgency to fully rest in reflection. But what if this tension was never fragmentation? What if it was range? You understand slowness because you were shaped by it. You understand speed because you survived it. You can sit in face-to-face silence without panic. You can navigate online complexity without fear. This is not contradiction, it is integration. Neuroscience suggests that exposure to diverse environments strengthens cognitive flexibility. The brain that has learned to move between between physical and digital, patience and immediacy, develops nuance. And nuance is rare. You can remember life before constant noise. That memory gives you perspective. You can operate within noise. That skill gives you adaptability. You are not stuck between eras, you translate between them. Bridges do not belong to one side of a river. They exist for connection. And perhaps the quiet pressure you have carried all these years, the subtle fatigue, the constant recalibration, was not evidence of misalignment. It was evidence of load-bearing. You carried tradition into transformation. You carried depth into speed. You carried memory into momentum. But integration does not mean endless endurance. It means awareness. It means recognizing that you do not have to prove relevance through exhaustion. You do not have to cling to the past to honor your depth. You do not have to armor yourself to maintain competence. You can choose pace. You can choose boundaries. You can choose stillness, even within acceleration. Because being a bridge is not about sacrifice, it is about perspective. And perspective softens pressure. You were not lost between generations. You were forming a wider lens, a lens that understands how things used to be and how they are becoming. And when you stop seeing your duality as tension, it begins to feel like quiet strength,